Hi guys, forgive us. This is, one of the issues with live events and part of the dynamic of being live here together. Welcome to McKinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahili, McKinsey's editorial director and your host for today's very special McKinsey Live. It's our capstone event for this year, the Future of Business 2021 and beyond, featuring McKinsey's global managing partner, Kevin Sneeder. Before we begin, just a quick note, we're going to take questions throughout this event, so you're welcome to ask questions at any point using the Q&A bar at the bottom of your live stream. We've got just 30 minutes together today, but we will try to share a couple of questions prior to the close of this event. And if we run out of time, we may also incorporate select questions into the text that accompanies the replay of this event on McKinsey.com. So be sure to visit the McKinsey Live section of our website in coming weeks to see whether your question has been answered. Worldwide, 2020 has been a year like no other in recent memory. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacted a tremendous human and economic toll, destabilizing both lives and livelihoods and upending almost every aspect of the way that we work and live. Joining us today to make sense of what we've learned and vitally to speak to what we can look forward to in the year to come is McKinsey's global managing partner, Kevin Sneeder. Kevin, welcome to McKinsey Live. It's great to see you and we're grateful for your time today.
Great to see you too.
Let's start this discussion with some context. Just in the past couple of days, we've had incredibly heartening news on the vaccine front, with the onset of mass inoculation in the UK yesterday and extremely promising results from vaccine trials in the US. We have even seen the media in the past 24 hours calling this the beginning of the end of the crisis. At the same time, we've seen record-breaking deaths in the US this week, as well as rising infection rates across the globe. And obviously, many businesses and even entire sectors are suffering. You're in regular conversations with leaders worldwide, Kevin. What are you hearing as we approach what appears to be a threshold in this crisis? Is the mood positive or negative at this juncture?
Well, I think the mood is shifting. I think there is now light at the end of the tunnel, and a sense that that light isn't another train heading our way, but actually is the prospect of an end to this pandemic. And it is what you just said. I think there is a growing awareness that we are likely nearer to the end of the pandemic than the beginning. And that's worth pausing and reflecting on. The world has been through an awful lot. This has been a horrendous humanitarian crisis. The numbers of deaths just makes one realize that anything we discuss feels a bit trite in that context. But I do think confidence is, I would say, building. There's a growing recognition that having gone this far, we have to get through in the Northern Hemisphere what is likely to be a tough winter. But you can begin to see that by the spring and certainly into the second and third quarter of next year, we should be looking at a very different set of economic indicators, and perhaps most importantly of all, a growing improvement in the general health condition. And after all, it's very hard to disconnect saving lives from saving livelihoods. Both have been the objectives since the beginning of this pandemic.
Yeah. Kevin, you've talked about what we call the next normal and the wide-ranging transformation that the pandemic has so propulsively catalyzed. At a high level, what are the critical trends that you expect to reshape the business landscape in 2021?
Well, it's always dangerous to get into the forecasting business. Somebody once said to me that astrology exists to make economic forecasting look good. So I'll put that in as the backdrop and then offer really, I think there's 8 forces or trends that are worth reflecting on. The first is one that's been very apparent and we've all experienced, was the acceleration of digitization and indeed of innovation. This way in which we're having a conversation today has been greatly advanced over the course of the pandemic. That's an innovation in and of itself. Secondly, the role of government is changing and has changed. Government is increasingly engaged and active, more so than in the past. Why? Because it's become the insurer, the payer, and the lender of last resort in many parts of the world. Thirdly, healthcare is undergoing really a recommitment to healthcare and a reinvention. I think across the globe, we've discovered which systems are healthy, caring, and systems. And as that has happened, there's been a general sense of healthcare investment and a recommitment to it will be a vital part of any economic plan going forward. A greater balance between social and economic goals. This has been a very challenging time on a humanitarian level. And in truth, it's also shed some light on other aspects of the world, the inequality, the way in which different parts of the world have been impacted, has made, I think, a real emphasis on this revisiting of how social priorities and economic priorities get reconciled. Fifth, a push for a green recovery. There was much talk as to whether we're going to have a brown or a green recovery. I think we're going to have a green one. And the reason is because actually it makes economic sense, and it certainly makes a lot of sense for our collective futures. And we've learned a lot about what happens when you neglect what ultimately can be foreseen and is definitely a systemic impact on the world, the environment. Six, a redefinition of work and the role of cities. I'm sure we'll get into this question of remote working. Many here are fortunate in that they can engage in remote work, but it's worth remembering that's for 20% or so of the population or the working population. For the vast majority, it's not actually going to be the norm. And I think we therefore have to have a conversation around what's going to be the balance between remote and in-person working, and what's going to happen to our cities needs to be thought of in that context. We're suddenly seeing shifting geopolitical and interconnection, the way in which geopolitics is playing out and how that's been exacerbated or accelerated, whichever phrase you prefer, in terms of this pandemic. It's certainly been a feature, and I'm sure we can discuss what's happening to multilateral and other institutions. And lastly, we've seen a shift from a world that increasingly was, you could say, a just-in-time economy, one where goods and products flowed just in time to make their way into the supply chain and get turned into finished products. And as we've seen a move from efficiency to resilience, that just-in-time economy, I think now also has a just-in-case part to it, just in case something happens. How do we plan and build in resilience? Those are some of the forces. I'm sure there's others we could discuss too.
Yeah, that's a super helpful overview. Why don't we take a closer look at several of these trends? Let's start with government. The crisis, as you've said, has been extraordinarily fast. It's been deep. It's been far-reaching. Say a bit more about how you see the role of government changing, both to spur the recovery and as we move forward into the next normal.
Well, government is some $16 trillion into that journey in terms of the fiscal stimulus and other support that's being provided and continues to be provided. And as a result, I think governments are going to be faced with a series of challenges. On the one hand, managing unprecedented levels of deficit without crippling their economies. And that's going to take private and public collaboration. Deficits worldwide could reach somewhere between $9 and $11 trillion this year. And think about a cumulative total of as much as $30 million by 2023. These numbers are huge. And in a world of low interest rates, one can start to see a journey towards ensuring that we maintain the vitality of our economies. But if, in the event of debt servicing costs rising, you could imagine a crowding out of vital investment. Decisions to print money at scale could prompt a rise in inflation. Rises in taxation could hamper business innovation and growth and harm countries' competitiveness. So there's a very complicated challenge for governments on the economic side. At the same time, they have a vital role to play in preserving and establishing trade policy and the basics of which trade will continue or resume. And certainly beyond the economic impact, they have a vital role to play in the health, social, and environmental goals that increasingly are high and right at the top of the agenda. So a much more involved role for government, in part because it's had to step in, as I've said, it's the payer, lender, and insurer, and in large measure because of these reconciliation of priorities, health, social, the environment, and the economy all have to be brought into balance. So we're going to see government playing an even more active role than it's played in the past.
Interesting. You just invoked innovation, and we've talked a lot about the unprecedented velocity of innovation and digitization during this pandemic. How will this affect trends in the future of work?
Well, just a word on the digitization point and then into the future of work issue. A lot of the digitization that we've experienced is the part we see, the business to consumer. And the reason why I wanted to make this point and transition into the future of work is actually a lot of what is now going to happen is in the business to business piece, how business gets conducted behind the scenes, the way in which processes occur, manufacturing occur. And that's going to have a profound nature in the future of work. Because what we are going to experience is something we were writing about and talking about before the pandemic. And we have the heading of automation, this notion that large parts of the economy could be automated. And I think back then we said, up to 60% of jobs could see more than 30% of the tasks automated. And we thought that would impact materially some 400 million workers around the globe. Well, what's happened in this pandemic is that trend has been vastly accelerated as a response to some of the challenges that we've all been experiencing. And as that trend has been accelerated, the challenging part of it is there was always a belief, and we certainly espouse this, that there would be more jobs on the other side of this automation period than there would be before. Think about the way in which desktop publishing revolutionized the way that we had access to the printed word and to thought that goes with it. There are actually many more jobs in the publishing world. It's just they're different from the old typesets and the kind of jobs that there were before. So there's a belief there'll be more jobs in the future. The challenge is the transition. And a lot of the jobs that we thought could help in the transition were those that have been actually quite impacted. Think of services, hospitality, leisure activities, very much impacted by the pandemic. So I still believe that we're going to see more jobs in the future than we have today because of the technology transition and because the future of work will bring that. But we're also going to see, I think, a bumpier transition because some of the jobs that were going to play a role in getting people reskilled and moved into a different type of work are now severely challenged. So the future of work is going to be, I think, profoundly impacted. And that's without getting into the discussion as to where work is conducted. Just a word or two on that. Where work is conducted isn't about a job, it's about the tasks, it's about the activities. And that's why when you really pull apart the type of work that can be done remotely, you end up saying, well, up to 20% of jobs 3 to 5 times a week could actually be done on a more productive basis remotely. But it's 20%. That's 4 or 5 times what we have today. But it's not 100%. And it's the other reason why I think it's important that we recognize that the future is going to be a world in which we do have remote working, but we still have an awful lot of in-person working. That will still be the vast majority. And the real question is how automation and the changing nature of work gets addressed as much as any conversation about who gets to work from home and who gets to work from an office.
Right. So the future of work speaks to this question of humans and labor. And we saw the rise of stakeholder capitalism begin prior to the pandemic. But like many trends, it has accelerated considerably over recent months, particularly since the killing of George Floyd in the US and the global protests that ensued over racial and social injustice. How do you see businesses actually moving to rebalance social and economic goals?
Well, I mean, the George Floyd moment and the racial injustice issues that occurred really exposed another very insidious virus that's been with us for far too long. And I think in that moment, business and others have rallied to say we have a part to play. And it's in a way the answer to your question. I think business through this pandemic has certainly been connected to very real issues where it's had to step up and play a role. Employers are ones who are providing safe work environments, who are making sure people are able to live and work in conditions that recognize the severe health challenge that the world is facing. Equally, they've had to play a part in ensuring that they provide environments where equity does exist. So there's a lot in this moment that business, I think, has seen and experienced. And it's why the move to stakeholder capitalism, which, as you say, was underway before the pandemic, has again been accelerated. Much of what we talk about in this pandemic is indeed an acceleration. And that's what we're seeing in this moment. I think business is now far more connected to the day-to-day, to the communities in which we all live and work. And in that moment, it's no surprise that therefore, I think there is an increased recognition that whilst it's attractive to say that the business of business is business, the reality is different. Business has a vital role to play in the community. And I think leaders of the business world now really see that and understand that it means that we are going to be accountable against a different set of metrics than perhaps the simple ones that used to exist before.
Mm-hmm. The pandemic has also, at least arguably, illuminated the potential severity of a future where climate issues go unmitigated. At the same time, some businesses and even entire sectors have had to shift into immediate, exigent survival mode. Do you think the crisis will accelerate or decelerate a global climate response?
Accelerate.
Mhm.
And I think it's because it's actually good business sense that gives me a confidence in putting that answer. I do understand and believe that right at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this moment, and it was more than a moment, it was several months, when there was a question around, will trade offs need to be made? But just think about a few economic realities. For every $10 million spent in renewable energy, 75 jobs are created. For every 10 million spent in energy efficiency, 77 jobs are created. For every $10 million spent in fossil fuel, 27 jobs are created. That gulf is enormous.
Mhm.
And in a $10 trillion plus, and I talked about far bigger numbers, cost and rising in terms of the expense, or maybe you could argue the cost of the inability to build resilience against the pandemic. Think about the cost of not now acting to build resilience against the environmental challenges the world faces. After all, spending a dollar building resilient infrastructure saves $6 in future costs. I could go on, economics are there. What that actually means is it's a false trade-off. I don't accept the argument of a trade-off, and I think that's actually what is increasingly driving the language and indeed the action around environmental. The reason we need a green recovery is because we need a jobs recovery. It's not because we're just thinking this is a good thing for 10 years from now. It's because of what needs to happen at this moment in time. And I think if you add to that the very real possibility that we don't have a green recovery because of the challenges associated of, for example, public ridership on the tube in London or the MTR or the MTA, you've got this challenge of confidence around using public transport. That could lead to more cars, more pollution in the street. That's the challenge. It's not the economics. The economics are pretty robust. It's how are we going to lead our lives? How are we going to make it possible to ensure that we can actually live day to day in an environmentally sound way? I think that's the challenge that everyone's going to be taking on. But I do believe it's going to be a green recovery.
Mm-hmm. And climate is one part of ESG concerns, of a set of ESG concerns. Do you want to say a few words on your perception of the staying power of ESG and purpose more generally in business?
Well, again, I think the staying power is directly correlated to a recognition that the ESG world is now one that actually occupies the economic high ground. There's been plenty of work done, and we've been involved in much of it, that looks at the economics of the ESG. And to understand the role that governance, social, and environmental factors now play, you start to really understand also the way in which the investor community has started to invest in and display and put forward ESG related funds, and actually how that's leading to companies that have got demonstrable progress on ESG being rated higher than those that don't. And it's also because we've actually now seen the similarities, and I won't go back to the environment, the E part, the similarities between the pandemic and indeed the way in which you could see the future is, I think, illustrative. Physical shocks, which translate into real economic impact. You can check that box. That's what the pandemic's had. Systemic. The factors move really, really fast and have broad impact on the whole system. They're dynamic. The past doesn't predict the future. Just think of the pandemic. Non-linear, the impact grows disproportionately. That's a factor here too. Risk multipliers, they make worse already challenging situations in terms of distribution and supply. Regressive, they hit the most vulnerable. And of course, a tragedy of the commons, what happens to my neighbor happens to me. And when you put all that together and you think about it, that's why the ESG movement has become an economic reality, as well as something that I think for many is a good, quote, thing to do. There are, of course, differences, but I do think this is a moment in time when ESG moves from being a slogan into a very practical and I think hard to measure. When I say hard measure, metrics are being introduced, so hard measures are being put in place. And I think that's the next step in a journey where ESG moves from being a three-letter acronym to actually something that really has real hold on economic performance and valuations.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a lot of interesting questions here in the feed. We have received quite a number of questions on leadership and on how best to lead into this seemingly uncharted geography. What do you see as the leadership capability gap going into 2021, and how could this be best addressed?
Leadership has many, many aspects to it, but if I reflect on what I've seen and heard from leaders in this pandemic, one of the big shifts is, I think, for a lot of leaders, it was previously the case that the focus is on what you did. The tangible strategy. Did you develop a good strategy? Did you have the answers to the tough questions? Did you have a path for the future, and so on? There's now an increasing recognition that a lot of leadership is about how you lead. Empathy. One leader said to me, I've got a new word which I'm trying to focus in on because I think it's very much a critical part of how a tough leader leads in the future. And I said, what's that word? And they said, love. How you exhibit love, how you understand. I do think that given the experience, the shared experience so many have had, that it has shifted to put more emphasis on really showing up in a way which means you understand, you can see what's going on, and then be able to work closely to address the concerns, the very everyday concerns that people have in the business world. That's a shift. So I think leadership capability is going to continue to shift towards embracing empathy and being able to demonstrate leadership in its full sense, as opposed to the academic, the intellectual, the visionary leadership that perhaps was given greater emphasis in the past.
Interesting. Question on globalization. What do you think the new outlook is for globalization in the future?
Well, globalization, in some sense, hit its peak in terms of the movement of physical goods. And I think much attention has been paid to that. And it's true, if you look at the flow of physical goods, I think we probably have passed peak globalization. I also think there's a recognition that the fruits of the previous global model did not impact everyone equally. And there's some real issues with globalization which have to be addressed. And it's led to a lot of the pressures which have indeed meant that there's a real focus and a conversation around how do we bridge what has actually been a shrinking inequality between countries, but a growing inequality within countries. That's also one of the reasons why globalization has understandably been under attack. Mm-hmm. There are some other parts which I think we should pay attention to. I think the movement of data and ideas is going to continue, and that's also a feature of globalization. I also suspect that when we are able to travel again, there'll be a big rebound and people on a leisure basis will be keen to travel. I think business travel has changed for good, but we're going to see a shift in terms of leisure travel and the desire to be back out there. So globalization is clearly going to have to change. It must address some of the issues which have been pointed out, rightly so, around inequality. But I also think we should hesitate from saying it's over, because there are parts of it, whether it's services, ideas, and indeed people when it comes to travel and touring, that I think will come back and be very much a feature of the future of globalization.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, I'm mindful of time. I'll take a final question from the audience. As a global leader yourself, what are you most inspired by or energized by as we move into 2021?
Well, I'm going to quote from my daughter when she graduated this summer from her high school. Her senior year, she graduated in the middle of the pandemic. And after she got the diploma, we were fortunate, and it was in a window when it was possible to have an in-person graduation. As she got the diploma and went back to her seat, I thought it's time for me to take a nap because the rather elderly head teacher stood up to give her speech. And I thought, okay, here we go. This is one just to, we'll be polite, but we'll have a quiet little snooze. But she caught my attention with her opening phrase when she said, "You are the class of 2020, and I'm from the class of 1968. And she continued, 1968 is widely thought of as the worst year the world faced after the end of the Second World War. But she says, I've got news for you, 2020 is probably even worse. So here's what I want you to think about. And she said, in 1968, a lot of terrible things happened. RFK was assassinated, MLK was murdered. There were riots on the streets of Paris. There was the Prague Spring got crushed. The Vietnam War was in terrible, terrible mode. So that was 1968. But then 1969 came along. And what happened in 1969? Concorde took to the air for the first time. So did the Boeing 747. The Beatles released Abbey Road with the iconic cover photograph of them crossing the zebra crossing outside Abbey Road Studios. Woodstock happened. I don't know if anyone was there, but Woodstock happened. And of course, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And she said to the class, what are you going to do to make sure that 2021 is to 2020 what 1969 is to 1968? And as I reflect on the innovation and the way in which people have come through so much and yet are showing amazing resilience and a real sense of purpose around what we need to do, I think that's what inspires me. It's the notion that we can and we will be part of a future on the other side of this pandemic where we've learned. I think a lot of innovation has happened, a lot of bold new ideas are going to be put into practice. And it leaves me with a sense of optimism, even though there's quite some distance to get to that future. Nevertheless, I think 1969 is a good metaphor for what 2021 and 2021 and beyond could hold.
Let's hope so. Kevin, great way to end. Congratulations to your daughter, Leadership Class of the Future. That was an incredible discussion. Thanks again for your time and insights. And thanks to everyone in our McKinsey Live audience for joining us, not just today, but in our series of events throughout this pandemic year. We would very much appreciate your feedback. So please take a minute to fill out the very, very brief 30-second survey that will appear when you close out of your McKinsey Live event screen. And please visit us at mckinsey.com for new content by Kevin and others, and to register for our 2021 series of McKinsey Live events, which will start in January. We've got a fantastic lineup. We're in the process of scheduling for the new year. It's going to touch on some of the themes Kevin talked about here today, including vaccination, etc. So check back in coming weeks for details. Happy holidays. Have a great day or evening, and see you in 2021. Be well.